We are delighted to see so many of you here today and some of you with your faculty. Let me explain how we came to be doing this particular set of programs. They are underwritten by the Fetzer Institute, and the Fetzer Institute was founded in the 1970s for the purpose of two things, two very simple things: to promote the awareness of and the adoption of the practices of love, forgiveness, and compassion in everyday life. The man who founded it, Mr. Fetzer, was a very successful businessman. He owned most of the newspapers, radios, and television stations throughout the Midwest, starting in Detroit and branching outward, until finally the FCC said, you cannot own everything in a single market, and he began to divest of some of them. He never wanted to control editorial opinion. He loved the idea that there was politics and there was raging local opinion because it just meant more newspapers and more radio stations. But when he began to divest of those, he bought the Detroit Tigers, which were also very successful during his period of ownership. And so he, upon his retirement, he used most of his income, most of his wealth to establish this Fetzer Institute. For the past 5 years, I've been serving as one of their advisors in the areas of the humanities. They are an operating foundation. They're not a grant-making foundation, so you have to be part of that organization to be able to have grant funds from them to put on programs. So this is one of the ones that Fetzer has underwritten, which is a social justice lecture series on the campus of American University, aimed at the students and the faculty of this university. And we are thrilled to see so many of you here today. To introduce our speaker, I'm going to introduce Joe Eldridge. But before I do that, most of you were handed this sheet of paper when you walked in that has a set of questions on it. And we really invite you and encourage you to fill this out. Fetzer requires that every one of their programs be assessed and have some underpinning of learnings. And this question asks you, how did we go about today addressing those questions of love and forgiveness through this lecture series, through this particular presentation? How does Human Rights Watch exemplify love or forgiveness or compassion in action? So please do fill them out for us. Turn them in as you leave. If you didn't get one, you can always put your comments using the hashtag #ExploreSocialJustice, and they will come right back to us. With that, let me introduce to you the university's chaplain, if you have not yet met him. Joe Eldridge has spent more than 25 years working in the area of public policy arena as an advocate and as an analyst on human rights issues and humanitarian issues. In 1991, he established the Washington office of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights. During the 1980s, he worked in Honduras, consulting on human rights and development issues. And after a 3-year stay in Chile in the early 70s, he co-founded the Washington office on Latin America and served as its first director. He has a master's in international relations from American University, a master's in theology from the Perkins School of Theology at SMU, and a doctorate in ministry from Wesley Theological Seminary. But Joe's very favorite place on this entire campus is on the second floor, the third floor of the library, overlooking the quad, where you can see his building at the other end.
What building is that?
Which one?
Flaming Cupcake, right.
Nice to see you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Nancy. And thank you all very much for coming. This is a real treat to have everybody here thinking about, focusing on, talking about international human rights. Reed Brody is a friend. He is also the counsel and spokesperson for Human Rights Watch, and for 25 years on the cutting edge of the human rights movement. Born and raised in Brooklyn, after law school, he went to work for the Assistant Attorney General for the state of New York doing consumer protection. After spending a few years there, he realized that human beings, human lives also needed protecting. In 1984, he up and went into the middle of a war. He saw that many innocent Nicaraguans were being killed because a conflict that the United States government was promoting. President Reagan had raised an illegal army called the Contras that was engaged in a campaign of terror against established, albeit a leftist Sandinista government. At considerable risk to himself, he documented those violations and published this book, which I'm happy to show you. It's kind of a relic. I don't think there are too many copies around. He has been documenting violations and seeking to bring justice to victims ever since. Last week, he was in Chad. Anybody know what the temperature was in Chad last week? Take a guess. It was hot, over 100 degrees, in the shade. For 15 years, he has been pursuing the prosecution of Hissène Habré, who stands accused of the torture and murder of thousands. Habré lives in exile in Senegal, and Reed persuaded the National Assembly of that country to create an extraordinary Africa chamber to try him. And if there's a conviction, I think Reed is right when he says that it would represent a turning point for justice in Africa. Reed's life is a witness to the power of truth and remembrance and reconciliation to transform societies. He knows that there can be no lasting peace without truth and accountability. He has demonstrated again and again with the UN, the International Commission of Jurists, or a group called Global Rights, and now with Human Rights Watch, along the way helping to rewrite and expand international human rights law to include the notion of universal jurisdiction. I have a hunch he's going to tell us more about that. For crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So this journey has taken him all over the world, to Chile, Salvador, Haiti, Indonesia, Sierra Leone, Chad, Senegal, just to name a few. We are really honored to welcome this innovative and courageous defender of human rights who knows that only when there is truth-telling, an end to impunity, and accountability can a durable healing and reconciliation ultimately occur. Will you join me in welcoming Reed Brody up here, please?
It's very difficult to follow a preacher I've been working and following Joe Eldridge since I went to Nicaragua. He didn't mention that it was his organization that published in 1985 my report, before it became a book, my report on atrocities being committed by the U.S.-backed Contras against the civilians of Nicaragua. I guess that incident was was probably where I certainly got my start looking at the issue of accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, the last century could probably be known as the century of genocide, beginning with the Armenians, the Holocaust, the Gulag, Rwanda, Bosnia, East Timor, and sorry, did I miss a few? Kosovo. We could Namibia. I mean, there are a number of smaller genocides, the Mayan Indians in Guatemala. And one of the things that almost all of those had in common was that for the longest time, no one was ever punished. It used to be said that if you kill one person, you go to jail. You kill 10 people, they put you in an insane asylum. You kill 10,000 people, they invite you to a peace conference. And essentially, that's the way the world worked. Most of you know that after the Second World War, the Nazi leaders were brought to justice at Nuremberg, which held out the promise of never again. That war crimes, genocide, which was not even yet a term, the perpetrators of those atrocities would be brought to justice. And yet, as the century continued, the Cold War made that impossible. And we saw people like Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, or on a much bigger level, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Mengistu of Ethiopia, just to name a few, who were able to live out their years or enjoy a peaceful exile. And it wasn't until the end of the Cold War and then the genocides in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda that the world first created international tribunals to bring to justice the perpetrators of those crimes. And today, when you look around the world, basically you see that in almost every instance of mass atrocities, the question of justice is on the table. Today, I mean, there are working groups all over trying to figure out how to bring Bashar al-Assad to justice. We saw Charles Taylor was brought to justice, Milosevic, Laurent Gbagbo. And so today, that phrase that I gave a few minutes ago is no longer really at least the norm. Justice today is always on the table when we see these kinds of crimes being committed. One of the things that I'm going to talk about is how these advances have opened up a double standard in justice. The International Criminal Court, which was created in 1998, as most of you know, which is now probably the most important piece of the international architecture to deal with the worst crimes. It's a court that over 120 countries have ratified. It sits in The Hague, and it is there to provide justice in cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, when national courts are unable or unwilling to do so. The problem is that many of the big powers, like the United States, Russia, and China, are not part of the court. And in fact, even use their veto on the can use their veto on the Security Council to protect other countries from being brought before the court who haven't signed the treaty. So Russia would protect Bashar al-Assad, for instance. China would protect Sri Lanka. The United States protects Israel. And so you have all these kind of zones of non-accountability before the International Criminal Court. All of the cases today before the International Criminal Court are actually cases from Africa. Now, most people I work with in Africa think it's great that the International Criminal Court is stepping in to protect victims in Africa. Desmond Tutu has, among others, eloquently stated that these are African victims who deserve justice. But the fact is that because all the cases are in Africa, because situations like Gaza, situations like Syria, situations like Chechnya, situations like Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib are not brought before the court, there is a perception and, in fact, a reality which I'll talk about, of double standards. One of the ways that activists like myself have sought to deal with those double standards and also to promote international justice is by using the concept that Joe referred to called universal jurisdiction. Universal jurisdiction is a principle of international law that says that some crimes are so heinous, that's why they're called crimes against humanity, that any court in the world can, if it has jurisdiction over the defendant, can bring that person to justice for those crimes. It's a principle that actually was first implemented by Israel when it captured illegally, but brought to justice legally, Eichmann from Argentina, and brought him to justice on the basis not of the that he had killed in Israel, but on the basis that these crimes were subject to the jurisdiction of any court in the world. And universal jurisdiction is kind of international law's answer to the spectacle of tyrants and torturers who cover themselves with immunity back at home. And in 1998, the same year actually, we had just come back from Rome, where the International Criminal Court was established. And a couple of months later came the news that the former dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, who had been in power in the 1970s and 1980s, had been arrested in England. Now, this was a dictator who he was arrested in England for crimes committed in Chile on the basis of a warrant issued by a Spanish judge. And this was this was the first modern test of this principle of universal jurisdiction. And on behalf of Human Rights Watch, I went to London, where he was under house arrest, to work on that case. And the case reached the British House of Lords, which at the time, the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, which at the time was was the Supreme Court of England and Wales. Now they actually have a Supreme Court. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International were permitted to intervene in the case, what the United States would be considered as amicus curiae. And we had barristers and solicitors. And in that room in the House of Lords, really human rights law, in a sense, came of age. I mean, these lofty propositions that we had been talking about in school and amongst ourselves about the Torture Convention and the Genocide Convention and the Nuremberg Principles, all of a sudden they were actually being applied. And they were being applied not just in any case, but in the case of I think many of you will be too young to remember that this was a man who was really the iconic Latin American dictator, and it was not a coincidence that Joe Eldridge, who spoke before me, actually founded a solidarity group, or I don't know what it's supposed to be called, but a human rights organization, the Washington Office on Latin America, after having witnessed and lived through the coup in Chile that destroyed democracy in Chile. And the Pinochet's coup d'etat really galvanized the world. Chile was a country with a long democratic tradition, and all of a sudden we had tanks in the streets, thousands of people being brought into the national stadium, but which in front of the eyes of the world. But even more importantly, people like Joe coming out of Chile, but even more important than that, hundreds of thousands of Chilean exiles coming to the United States, going to England, going to Venezuela, going to other countries to talk about what was going on. And much of the birth of the modern human rights movement comes from the impetus given by those Chilean exiles. And in that room in the House of Lords, was filled with those people. And it was for me as if human rights kind of had come full circle, because it was those people who had given impetus to groups like Amnesty International, had resulted in the creation of the Torture Convention, had resulted in the creation of these human rights laws that were now being used, in fact, to arrest this Chilean dictator in England on charges brought by a Spanish judge. And the legal proceedings actually dragged on for 8 months. I had gone for 3 days, and I ended up staying there for 8 months. And at the end of it, the judges held that Pinochet challenged his arrest in court. He said, "You can't arrest me. I was a former president of my country. I have immunity." And the House of Lords, really, I mean, one of the most conservative, I mean, think of the United States Supreme Court if they were all white men over 70. That was the British House of Lords, one of the most conservative courts in the world, ruled that some crimes were, in fact, so beyond the bounds of international law that that same international law could not at the same time afford the person who committed those crimes immunity. And it was really, you know, at that point I was about 40 years old, I guess. And as a human rights lawyer at the time, I was used to being right always, but losing. And here, all of a sudden, the British House of Lords said that Pinochet had to be extradited to Spain. And it was a very heady moment in the international human rights movement. We had created laws that were actually being applied to hold a dictator to account. And there was a kind of an effervescence, and people around the world started contacting Human Rights Watch and Amnesty saying, well, wait a second, what about so-and-so, and what about Suharto, and what about Straussner, and what about this person? And what followed from that case was what people have described as a justice cascade. And you saw in country after country in Latin America, other former rulers being brought to justice. And as many of you know, in the late 80s and the 90s, there were transitions from dictatorship to democracy in many Latin American countries. But most of them, in fact, all of them, left either decided not to prosecute the people who'd committed those crimes, or in many cases, they were actually stayed in power. But one of the things that I've learned in my work is that victims never lose their thirst for justice. The person who tortured or burned down their village or who tortured their family may be there, and they may not be able to do anything, but as soon as they can, they will. And it's something that does not die. And it's something that until, in my experience, until it happens, people really can't move on. And so after the Pinochet case kind of opened up this justice cascade, and people began to see that there was a possibility to use the law to bring to justice people who seemed out of the reach of justice. And so we were getting, as I said, these, you know. Now, we realized that, of course, it's not enough to have a law. One of my first rules as an activist lawyer is that you need to create political will in order to have a law applied, particularly a law that goes against the rich and the powerful. In the case of Pinochet, the stars were in alignment. In England, Margaret Thatcher had just been defeated. Tony Blair had come in. He was already moving to the center, but Pinochet was something he could kind of give to the progressive wing of his party. In Spain, where the judge, this very activist judge, Judge Garzón was, people knew what was going on and were massively in support of this case against this iconic Latin American dictator who had tortured many of their neighbors in people who had fled to Spain. But we realized it wasn't going to be easy. And even as Pinochet was in detention, in house arrest in London, we started to try a lot of other cases. At the time, Saddam Hussein's right-hand man, a man named Izzat Ibrahim el-Douri, who is still today the highest surviving member of the Saddam regime, whose signature is on Human Rights Watch published documents in which his signature is on orders to gas the Kurds, went to Austria for medical treatment. We said, Pinochet, Austria has an obligation under international law to arrest him. Well, Austria was more interested at the time in its membership of OPEC with Iraq than it was in justice, and Izzat Ibrahim went home. Idi Amin, many of you know, was in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia is less likely, I have to say, to deliver justice than Austria was. But we went to see the Saudi ambassador in Geneva. We were actually retained by, or we were solicited by the South Asian community in Uganda that had been decimated and sent into exile by Idi Amin, and he was in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian ambassador told me that I did not understand Bedouin hospitality, that when you allow somebody into your tent, you can't ask him questions, which turns out not to be true, actually. There was a case here that Wola was involved in, a former Peruvian, or actually at the time a Peruvian member of the intelligence services, Anderson Kohatsu, was here in the United States. And when WOLA and Human Rights Watch found out that he was here in the United States, they immediately swung into action. They located people that he had personally tortured, including a paraplegic woman who became paraplegic, who was living in Sweden. The FBI actually detained him for questioning, and the Clinton administration intervened to have him freed because, again, their relationship with the dictator Fujimori of Peru was more important than justice in this case. And so we saw a number of cases like that. Mengistu of Ethiopia, probably if there's one person, well, I guess that there are a lot of candidates for this, but certainly somebody who's responsible, allegedly, for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in Ethiopia is still living actually in Zimbabwe. He went to South Africa for medical treatment. We thought South Africa, candidate to do the right thing. South Africa also let him go back without. One of the cases that came to us, and that's what the PowerPoint that I'm going to do, and that's where I was actually just yesterday, or day before yesterday in Chad, is the case of the former dictator of Chad, Hissène Habré. And we were, at the time, while Pinochet was still in jail, in house arrest, the head of the Chadian Human Rights Commission came to see me at Human Rights Watch, said, you know, we have somebody who is responsible for many more deaths than Pinochet. And he's in Senegal, which is also in Africa. And what really struck us at Human Rights Watch about the case was that the pushback to the Pinochet case, a legitimate argument, although always put forth in bad faith by people who want to protect dictators, was, well, wait a second, why is it that it's only the Englands and the Spains of the world who are prosecuting people from Chile? Why isn't it the other way around, or why isn't it people from the South who are prosecuting people from the South and stuff like that? And here was a case of the former dictator of Chad in Africa who was living in Senegal in Africa. And Senegal was the first country to ratify the statute of the International Criminal Court. It signed all the treaties. It's a human rights beacon in Africa. And so we started to work on that case. And I have this PowerPoint, and as I said, I just came back from Chad. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of bring you into exactly what we've been doing for the last 15 years on this case. So here we go. So we got a map of, oh, no, I thought, sorry. So Chad is in the middle of Africa, nowhere near the Ebola countries. Really, essentially, as I told the U.S. ambassador the other day, in the middle of nowhere. It's surrounded by Libya and Sudan. It's half desert country. Habré ruled Chad from 1982 to 1990, supported, as you might suspect, by the United States and France, and there's my friend Ronald Reagan at the bottom. The United States supported him as a bulwark against Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi, if you go back to the map, you see that Libya is right above Chad, and Gaddafi had this very expansionist view of Libya's borders, and Reagan had designated him as the mad dog of the Middle East and saw the possibility, in the words of then Secretary of State Alexander Haig, of bloodying Gaddafi's nose by kind of coming from the bottom and giving him a military defeat in Chad. And so the United States, in the very first covert operation of the Ronald Reagan era, brought Hissène Habré to power. And then supported him during his rule for 8 years until he was overthrown in 1990. When he was overthrown, a Truth Commission accused him of 40,000 tortures, 40,000 murders. The most common form of torture was called the abattoir, and just last week I was with a number of people who were tortured that way. You may recognize a primitive form of waterboarding. And of course, corruption and human rights abuse, particularly in developing countries, go hand in hand. And the Truth Commission found that Habré had basically emptied out, and these are checks that were written, basically emptied out the treasury. And when he went to Senegal, he basically took he took whatever he had with him, and he used that money to set himself up in Senegal. Mass graves. One of the worst prisons was called the Piscine. This was actually a swimming pool, and it was covered over, and the cells were put down inside the swimming pool. I've been there many times. It's really one of the most the product of a cruel mind to put people in the bottom of a swimming pool, and only the only things for air are those at the top. These are demonstrations. So Hissène Habré, the dictator of Chad, living in Senegal. And what we did at Human Rights Watch was that we helped the victims go to Senegal and file a case. Unlike in the American legal system, in the continental legal system, victims actually, which is a very interesting kind of feature of the system, victims can actually file a case against any criminal case. I mean, if you were a victim of a robbery or a murder, you can actually go into court and file the case yourself. You don't have to go through a prosecutor or the police. And so this is some of the lawyers and the victims and me, 15 years younger, at the steps of the courthouse. So here's Senegal, just so you know where Senegal is. It's actually easier to get from Washington to Senegal, where there are direct flights, than it is from Chad to Senegal, where there are no direct flights, where you have to go across the continent to Ethiopia, or you have to make about 4 or 5 stops. And much to our surprise, an independent judge, a young judge, actually took the complaints, interviewed the witnesses and the victims who had come to Senegal, and indicted him in February 2000 for torture and crimes against humanity. This is the cover of the main kind of African Francophone magazine, a dictator facing justice. But as often happens, the president a new president was elected, he intervened to stop the case, essentially, and to get the case thrown out. As we were investigating, we actually came across the files of his political police. We actually found tens of thousands of documents that his political police had left behind, including death certificates, lists of prisoners, and lo and behold, information about training courses that some of the worst torturers in Chad had taken in the United States. In those documents alone, and apparently I learned later that there were many, many more documents that we hadn't found. In those, we put those documents that we had found in this abandoned building here are now on CD-ROM and searchable, as we kind of do in this business. And they give the names of 1,208 people who were killed and over 12,000 different kind of victims. The victims were thrown out in Senegal, but we didn't give up. And we went around the world looking for a country that had the jurisdiction, that gave its courts jurisdiction to try this kind of crime, even if the defendant or the victims were not from that country. And Belgium had, at the time, what was called a universal jurisdiction law that allowed the Belgian courts to bring to justice cases of crimes against humanity, even if there was no connection with Belgium. As you can imagine, we weren't the only people to discover that law. And cases began to get filed in Belgium. There were actually three trials relating to the Rwandan genocide in Belgium. And we found, actually, we had our Chadian partners went to Belgium and found even Chadian, it was not necessary for the case, but they went to the Chadian community in Belgium and found torture victims there. And so that gave kind of political impetus to the case. One of the things we had learned, again, from the Pinochet case was the need to create political support. And what we tried to do, when the case against Pinochet was filed in Spain, the Spanish judge worked on the basis of universal jurisdiction, but he told us that, you know, it was really important to the case that we had Spanish victims, because that got Spanish people involved in the case. And we did the same thing in Belgium. We had Chadian people who were Belgians of Chadian origins. And the Belgian judge and the prosecutor spent 5 years investigating the case, and went to Chad, took the documents we had, went into the prisons. When we began the case 15 years ago, and we were talking with the victims, one of the victims said to me, he said, basically, are you crazy? He said, since when has justice come all the way to Chad? And when these guys came to Chad, when this judge and the prosecutor and 5 policemen and a court reporter and cameras and everything, they came to Chad, one really got the feeling that justice had come to Chad. And Chad requested Senegal to extradite Hissène Habré. Senegal went to the African Union, said, what should we do? And then we started working with the African Union to craft a response. And the African Union created a committee of eminent jurists. And the committee of eminent jurists said, Senegal, you have to try Hissène Habré on behalf of Africa. Remember that I said that all of the cases of the International Criminal Court are in Africa. And there's become this tug of war between the African Union and the International Criminal Court. And the African Union has accused the International Criminal Court, even though the lead prosecutor is African, even though the head of the treaty body that supports it is African, even though the the new president of the court is African, even though 33 African states, more than any other part of the world, have ratified the treaty, has attacked the court as a Western court. And the Habré, we were able to convince the African Union that the Habré case represented an opportunity for Africa to show that these kinds of crimes could be prosecuted in Africa. And so we were able, when the case first went to, when Senegal first went to the African Union with the case, we were like, so wait, you're going to ask Robert Mugabe and Omar el-Bashir and Colonel Gaddafi and these people what should be done about somebody who allegedly committed crimes? But we were able actually to make an ally of the African Union by showing them that this was a case to show that Africa could deal with these crimes. And Senegal, this is the president of Senegal, agreed to prosecute. But then, this was 2006, years passed, they changed their laws, but then they asked for $100 million from the international community to try the case. And they spent years negotiating. These are the people I work with. This woman here is an incredibly brave woman who was actually shot, who actually had a grenade thrown at her by one of Habré's people, and walks with shrapnel from the grenade in her legs. And she filed the case and said, now you have the laws, now you have to do it. But nothing happened. We enlisted Desmond Tutu, and we got a coalition of over 100 African human rights groups to call for Habré's prosecution. Finally, we were able to convince Belgium to take the case to the International Court of Justice. We had created in Belgium a coalition of political parties from, Belgian politics are very arcane. There's Flemish and French, and there's a six-party coalition government. We had brought the victims to Belgium. We had met with the Prime Minister of Belgium. We met with the Foreign Minister. And we convinced Belgium to take this case to the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice. And in 2012, the International Court of Justice ruled that Senegal had to prosecute Hissène Habré, my son, hold on. Okay, whatever. That Hissène Habré had to prosecute, that the ICJ had to prosecute Hissène Habré without further delay. And a new president was elected in Senegal, Macky Sall. We had spent each year, we had been taking the victims from Chad to Senegal. We had been holding public fora in Senegal. One of the big problems, of course, in a case like this is that the crimes are committed in Chad. The court, Habré is in Senegal. And we raised a lot of money to bring the Chadians to Senegal, to make a documentary about the case that was shown on Senegalese TV, and to develop public opinion in Senegal so that when a new president came in, they would agree to prosecute Habré. They created a court with the African Union, as Joe said, and that court is now. These are some of the victims and their lawyers who will participate in the proceedings as civil parties. And last July, the court indicted Hissène Habré on charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and torture, and he is now in detention awaiting trial. The judges from Senegal have been going to Chad. They've interviewed over 2,500 victims and witnesses. These are some of the people who they went to interview. And what we've been doing, as in the Pinochet case, is that we've been trying to use the proceedings in Senegal as a lever for the victims back in Chad. And so what happened is that now all of Hissène Habré's accomplices who are still in Chad are now being brought to justice. This is a headline from the newspaper last week. 27 accused accomplices of Hissène Habré indicted This is a meeting we held last week following that with the people there. And a trial is scheduled for May 2015. So this case has the potential to be a turning point for justice in Africa. But I could leave you there, and it could be a good story. But I want to go back to what I talked about double standards. The Belgian law, which was very effective for Rwanda, which was very effective for our case, when a case was filed against U.S. officials for alleged crimes in the Iraq War, Donald Rumsfeld, then the Secretary of Defense, went to Belgium and he said, listen, this is NATO headquarters. He said, if NATO officials can't come to Belgium without worrying that there are going to be lawsuits filed against them, maybe we'll move NATO somewhere else. And the law was repealed. The Spanish law, which was used in the Pinochet case, when cases were filed in Spain based on Guantanamo, as well as cases filed for China and Tibet, as well as cases filed for Israel and Gaza, the diplomatic pressure became so heavy that Spain repealed its law. And so what we've seen is that it's even not so simple to get justice in the cases of on behalf of victims of poor countries, but that it's almost become impossible to try to bring to justice crimes committed by developed countries. Human Rights Watch, I wrote a report for Human Rights Watch several years ago called Getting Away with Torture that looks at the U.S. detention program during the war on torture and found that there's, I mean, it wasn't a surprising finding, but that there was very solid information about the torture and ill treatment of detainees. President Bush admitted in his biography that he approved the waterboarding of detainees, something that the U.S. has always considered to be torture, and that I showed you as a torture method in Chad. The CIA, as you know, had a secret detention program in which prisoners were essentially disappeared. Detainees during the Bush administration were rendered to countries countries like Gaddafi's Libya, Assad's Syria, Mubarak's Egypt were sent there to be interrogated and were tortured. My colleagues at Human Rights Watch, after the fall of Gaddafi, were in the headquarters of the intelligence agency in Tripoli and found binders in which the U.S. and the UK sent people, took detainees and sent them to Libya under Gaddafi and sent them the questions they wanted Gaddafi's Secret Service to be asking these people. To us, the evidence is very, very clear that crimes were committed, that George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, George Tenet, the head of the CIA, they have a case to answer for their involvement in those crimes. Now, I'm not trying to compare, Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo with Darfur and with 40,000 killings. I think we need to be clear. At the same time, when certain countries like the United States hold themselves apart from justice, it makes it very, very difficult. I can tell you that a day does not pass when somebody somewhere tells Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, wait a second, you're telling us that we should prosecute the people who committed torture here? Are you serious? Didn't the United States commit torture? And although it would appear that, that the torture program is not being pursued the same way today, that there are no secret prisons as there were under the Bush administration, the decision by President Obama basically to say, okay, that was the past, we're not going to do that, reduces torture to a policy decision, a bad policy. No, it's not a bad policy, it's a crime. And when we go to Argentina and we go to Chad and we say you have to prosecute people who committed torture, it means what it means. And even now, as I'm sure you've been following the papers, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence cannot even publish, or has not even yet been able to publish, a redacted executive summary to tell us about the torture program. So, again, I don't want to compare, genocide with Guantanamo, but it makes it very, very difficult to be a human rights activist and to press for human rights standards when the most symbolically important country in the world chooses to basically not abide by those standards. So I'll leave it there. I think I've talked probably too much, and maybe we'll have questions and answers. Thank you. Yes. The young man over there on the left. Yes.
One of these, like Pinochet or some of the other, I'll just use your first case with Pinochet.
Yeah.
If we bring them to trial,
Yeah.
and if they are found guilty, if there were some way to have the jury find that, what is justice?
What is justice? Justice there are many components. I mean, I think we teach classes in that. What is justice? Justice has many components, and it depends, I think, who you're looking at. I'm actually, even though we're focusing here on dictators, and I've been talking about dictators, and I'm kind of known as the Dictator Hunter, it's actually the victims that concern me a lot more. And I can say that to a victim, justice means dignity. It means being treated as an equal to the person who did that. I mean, one of the countries that I have spent the most time in is Haiti, actually. I didn't get to talk about Haiti, but Haiti is a wonderful laboratory in my mind for just about everything. And the fact that for centuries in Haiti, a small elite has basically been able to get away with everything, and that the law has never intervened to protect the great mass of poor, has left people feeling and internalizing the idea that they are not part of society, that they have no rights, that the state is not there, the law is not there to protect them. And I think the first thing that victims are looking for is the dignity of saying something bad happened to me and it's being recognized. I mean, justice means, there's actually kind of now an agreed upon menu of what transitional justice means. It means bringing the bad guys, or at least some of the bad guys, to court, because you can't bring, depending on what kind of regime it is, you can't bring everybody to court. It means compensation for people who've been tortured or families who've been. It means truth about what happened. So you can have, if you have, one or two cases of people being prosecuted but no wider truth about what happened, it can almost look like those cases are being just kind of rushed through to, you're just kind of scapegoating a couple of people. If you have truth without justice, that can be very bitter. So these are the guys who did it, but we're not going to do anything to them. It also generally means reform. How can we make sure that this does not happen again? What can we do in terms of putting the civilians in charge of the military, in terms of creating human rights structures, in terms of creating a freedom of the press and stuff, to make sure that this does not happen again. So justice, I mean, criminal justice, truth, reform, and compensation are considered to be kind of the pillars. And remembrance, very important. In Chile, you can go, and there are places where you can go in Chile and read the names, like the Vietnam Memorial here. You can read the names of people whose lives were taken. In Argentina, the Mechanical School of the Armed Forces, which was a torture center, is now a museum. We've been trying, one of the victims' requests in this case is to turn the piscine into a museum. So all of those, I mean, so justice has many, many forms. Yeah, yeah. And then we'll ask this, after this, students only, unless you're a student.
One of the euphemisms often used for torture is enhanced interrogation techniques. And those techniques, at least in our context here in the U.S., have been justified on the grounds of imminent national security concerns.
Right.
Is it possible to reconcile those two concepts?
You know, unfortunately, when we look at, I mean, we look at Pinochet's government, we look at Argentina, there's always a justification. If you look at the justification that the Argentine junta used for what it did, it was to, you know, to fight, you know, external communism and terrorism. You know, obviously, I mean, there are things that a government can do in times of crisis, but torture is not one of them. And one of the things that we believe that the Senate Special Select Committee on Intelligence report is going to show us, if it ever comes out, it's going to show us two things. First of all, it's apparently. One is it's going to show us that this was much more widespread than the government said it was. And the second, and probably the most important, is that contrary to certain claims by Dick Cheney and others, it was not torture that developed the actionable intelligence that was able to save lives. I mean, you know, one never wants to say never in any situation. I don't anyway. But, you know, FBI, I mean, when FBI people went to Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, they were freaking out. They said, this is not the way you get information. Law enforcement, I mean, you know, in the Middle Ages, you tortured people and they talked. And we've come a long way from that. And we've developed police methods, and we've developed skillful methods of developing human intelligence, and with some less skillful methods of, like, electronic intelligence. But one of the most important lessons from the Senate's investigation apparently is that the claims that torture led to saving lives will be debunked. Yeah. In the red shirt. Sorry, I don't know. Maybe I get a moderator here. Hold on, let me just text my son.
All right, so my question is kind of based off what we're talking about in class. My world politics, we're kind of talking about the question of, is America an empire, and this idea of Americanization. So my question is, I guess, who is it to say that America itself should kind of have that policing power of justice, I guess, and putting these people on trial, while at the same time, critics could say that America itself has, you know, done, I guess, unethical things and has engaged in torture. So why is it that America, I guess, is in that position of power where we can try people from these other countries, where say, if another country had more power, they might even try people from America for similar things? I hope that came out right.
That's a big question. I mean, obviously, you know, the United States was developed as a city shining city on a hill, and the idea that the United States is a country of freedom and is very ingrained, you know, in Americans. At the same time, you know, there are rules, and it's very, I can tell you, I mean, many of you come from other countries, it would appear, or have ties to other countries. I mean, it's very, when you tell somebody else, well, you know, we can tell you what to do because somehow we're better. You know, it's a very slippery slope when you say that the United States is better than another country and therefore can do, I mean, whether that's the case or not, it's a very dangerous argument because China also believes that from Confucius on, it has a superior civilization. I spent many years in France, living in France, where I can also assure you that they think they're the coolest people on earth, and that they have the most universal civilization. So, you know, it's a very, I mean, it's obviously very tempting because we hear that from our politicians all the time. We are the best, we are the greatest, we are the most free. But, you know, we live in an interdependent world where that argument, just as an argument, is very offensive to other people. Okay. Good question. I mean, there is an international Bill of Rights. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United States may be lagging behind, but it's signed many, many treaties saying what human rights are. Now, not every human rights violation subjects you to criminal prosecution on an international level. I mean, shutting down a newspaper is a human rights violation because it's a violation of the freedom of the press in most circumstances, which is guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is guaranteed in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other treaties which we sign. But it doesn't mean that you can be prosecuted in another country. It doesn't usually even mean you can prosecute in your own country for that. So there are certain human rights violations that are international crimes, and those are things like torture, war crimes, which is essentially attacking civilians, basically not respecting the distinction between civilians and military. Genocide, which of course is the crime of crimes, where you're basically trying to wipe out an entire race or linguistic group or ethnic group. Crimes against humanity, which are the massive and systematic use of torture, murder, things like that. Those are kind of the crimes that are prosecutable on the international level. But I mean, it's a human rights violation, actually, not to provide universal education. Universal primary education is a guaranteed right under treaties that under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but you can't prosecute somebody for not having done that. So, I mean, the rules, the rights are set forth essentially in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Some students, yes. And then you. Yeah.
Given that we're moving beyond a policy, trying to put that policy of torture. Yeah. Given that we're trying to move beyond that policy of torture, looking at more of like a broad spectrum of like war crimes, have there been any attempts to try the U.S. or anyone in particular for drone strikes as a human rights violation? And if so, who do you try?
Right. Well, I mean, drones are actually an incredibly complicated legal issue, because the first question is which laws apply. And I don't want to give a class here, but essentially the question is, at what point do you have to try to capture an enemy rather than kill him? So if there's a bank robber over there running, I mean, I got to try to capture him. I can't send a drone to kill him, right? Because I'm engaged in law enforcement. The question is, at what point am I engaged in a war and that person is actually an enemy? Because the only time legally that you have the right to kill somebody, well, in law enforcement cases, or you're actually entitled to kill an enemy soldier. That's, I mean, you don't arrest people for killing an enemy soldier unless you decide to call them terrorists, and then you, but, so then the question is somebody in Yemen or in Pakistan an enemy soldier? Or am I supposed to go to the government of Pakistan and say, would you please arrest that person if you don't mind? And obviously, the government of Pakistan or the government of Yemen is not going to arrest that person. And so then the question becomes, do I have the right to go there, and under what circumstances? And of course, you know, the problem, one of the problems with drones is that, again, you asked about what, if the United States can do it, why can't other people do it? I mean, what happens when China gets drones? What happens when ISIS has? I mean, ISIS obviously is not going to deal with, they don't care what we did. They're just going to do what they do. But, I mean, the problem is that the United, that with the exception, actually a few weeks ago or last week, while I was in Chad, I saw that some of the contractors from Blackwater were actually convicted for murdering Iraqi citizens in it is almost impossible. The United States has essentially made it impossible to bring a U.S. person to justice in another country. I remember when the case was filed in Spain against for Guantanamo. And this was already under the Obama administration. I had a friend who Joe knows who was then the White House counsel who called me up and said, Reed, what's going on? I said, there are going to be a lot of these suits around the world. And I said, well, you know, unless the United States deals with these cases, there will be a lot of, I mean, if the United States, obviously, the ideal is for people, American officials who have engaged in torture and murder to be prosecuted under the American system. But just as the Chilean victims who couldn't get justice in Chile went to Spain and England, people are going to look for justice elsewhere. But the fact is that as a political matter, the United States has basically made it impossible by making sure that all these laws, anytime a law is being applied to the United States, I mean, even in the case of Spain, WikiLeaks documents showed that even the Obama administration was putting pressure on the Spanish government to drop these cases against Bush administration officials, and was actually trying to get the Spanish government to oust from the case this Judge Baltazar Garzón, who was the most kind of aggressive in going after these cases. So it's very difficult as a practical matter. I mean, what we can do is name and shame, which is what kind of the standard human rights arsenal is to shine the light on violations and denounce the violations. The possibility of criminal prosecution really is something that's only opened up for us since Pinochet in 1990 and the International Criminal Court in 1998. Yes, so somebody, the woman, yes.
I guess on that note, towards the beginning of your talk, you also mentioned one of the major obstacles is not only that these major countries have become untouchable, such as the United States, but they can also use their leverage, such as on the Permanent Security Council, to protect other countries. So my question about that is there any way to overcome that, or is it just a matter of waiting out until political will changes?
I mean, yeah, I mean, what we are campaigning for is for every country in the world to ratify the statute of the International Criminal Court. So, because the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over countries, over nationals of countries that have ratified, or when the Security Council refers a case. So, in the case of, you know, in the case of Gaddafi, Libya hadn't ratified, but the Security Council referred the case. In the case of Omar al-Bashir of Sudan for Darfur, that's what happened. But obviously, those countries are going to veto. Very interestingly, right now, the Palestinian Authority actually has the power now, because for the longest time, many people were trying to get the war in Gaza and the crimes allegedly committed in the war in Gaza before the International Criminal Court. And when the General Assembly recognized Palestine as a state, Palestine then now actually has the authority to invoke the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court for crimes committed in Gaza. And there's a huge amount, and they haven't. And it has become a major diplomatic bargaining point, actually. And what you have, there are two things that are holding it back, interestingly. One, actually, the Western countries, including countries that are very supportive of the court, like Britain and France, have been pressing Palestine not to do it. But also Hamas doesn't want them to do it. Because if the court has jurisdiction over the conflict, it's not just over Israel that it would have jurisdiction. It would also have jurisdiction over Hamas leaders who have been committing war crimes. And President Abbas is kind of in this situation where he's got one bullet, as it were. He's got one bullet, which is to approve the court. And he knows that once and so he's trying to, basically what he has said recently at the General Assembly was, we want 3 years. If we're not, if we don't have an independent state in 3 years, we are going to, among other things, recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And then, for those of us actually who believe in international justice, all of the things we've been talking about would change. If the International Criminal Court started looking at crimes committed in Gaza, all of this double standards and the entire thing would flip. It would be the Western countries that would be attacking the court, probably. And so the entire kind of the landscape of this would change, interestingly. Yeah.
So you mentioned the crucial importance of societies seeking and finding justice. And so about the cases that you've mentioned today, I wanted to hear from you if, in your experiences, you have found, so societies react to the experiences they have in different ways and find that justice in different ways. But have you found any baseline criteria to that justice that are consistent to societies?
If I understand I'm not sure I understand your question, but one of the things that I see as constant, as I said before, is that victims will seek justice. And that the powerful, and that the people who committed the crimes will try to block that justice. And so really it's a question of, ironically, you want justice to be impartial and blind and fair and independent. And yet you have to do a huge amount of political mobilization to get to that point. And my experiences, and about 6 months ago, about a year ago, I was in Guatemala, where there was also a trial of a former dictator, Rios Montt. And they had many of the same experiences I've had, and I've been involved in the prosecution of the former Haitian dictator, Jean-Claude Duvalier, who died a few weeks ago. And I think there's some very common themes in each of these things. One is victims pushing and pushing and pushing. And creating, when I met with the people in Guatemala, this was, as some of you may know, the former dictator of Guatemala, Rios Montt, was tried in his own country for genocide for crimes committed 30 years ago against the Mayan Indians. First time ever that a leader had been prosecuted for genocide in his own country. Genocide against probably among the most disenfranchised people in the world, the highland Indians of Central America. And yet, for 30 years, they never gave up. And they pushed, and they took people, and they told their stories, and the NGOs, the human rights groups got in them. I was talking to somebody, they said, you know, you push and you push, and then one day the door opens and everything seems to be easy. I mean, it turns out that he was convicted and then the conviction was overturned and it's become much less easy than it appeared. But you need to create a political climate to do this, and it's not easy. And you know, it's going to depend on a lot of things that may be beyond your control. Yeah, with the baseball hat. See, it pays to wear a hat sometimes.
So you mentioned justice in the United States. What are your feelings on the Kuala Lumpur trials that were done against Bush and several senior members of his administration a few years ago, and they were tried and convicted in absentia of war crimes in Iraq?
Yeah, thanks. He asked about these trials. They were kind of, I don't know how you would call them, but I mean, there is an honorable and tradition in the world, beginning with the Bertrand Russell tribunals for crimes committed by the United States in Vietnam. Now I realize I forgot one of my favorite people to mention, Henry Kissinger. That you know, when you can't actually get justice before a regularly constituted court, you kind of present a trial. I have to admit that I didn't follow. I mean, I'm aware of them. I didn't follow them. You know, obviously they tend to be organized by people who have a preconceived notion of what the outcome should be, because that's why they're pushing for it. I think there's, you know, so that's the pro and the con. The pro is to get out there the idea that there should be accountability. But then it's usually very hard to implicate kind of a judicial, to kind of replicate the independence and impartiality of regularly constituted courts. But it is, you know, I mean, many times around, if we didn't get Hissène Habré tried, we were going to do that. We were going to hold a people's court and bring that evidence. Yeah. Yeah.
There are some countries that, or there are some people that believe by boycotting imports and by not visiting a country as a tourist, that they're not showing any support to their international politics. Do you think that by doing this it's effective? Like, is that an effective way to stand up against wrong politics?
Well, it certainly can be. I mean, my generation and Joe's generation, you know, lived through the boycott of South Africa. That was one of the reasons. I mean, you know, one of the great achievements of, you know, the world movement, solidarity movement, was the ending of apartheid in South Africa. And one of the keystones of how that happened was the rest of the world refusing to deal with South Africa, refusing to dig sports with South Africa, boycotting South Africa, refusing to invest in South Africa. And at a certain point, the white leaders of South Africa realized that it was in, you know, their better interest to negotiate and to arrange a transition of power. It's difficult. I mean, I usually, my touchstone would be what my peers in that country would feel. So when Aung San Suu Kyi said, you know, don't come to Burma, don't deal with Burma, that's how I felt. But then when she said deal with Burma, you know, and you know, you have to figure out who. I mean, one of the problems generally with sanctions is that it's a very blunt tool. Who is hurt by sanctions? It tends not. I mean, if they're not crafted correctly, sanctions hurt the people. They make people poorer. They make, you know, people like you in that country who now can't sell their goods, who now don't have jobs, who things get worse. Over the last 20 years, you know, the arsenal of sanctions has become much more fine-tuned. And so you have things like freezing people's bank accounts. So you I mean, that's what they do with Russia now. You know, you freeze you travel ban. You don't deal with the president and his cronies. You do things in which you're trying to target the wrongdoers and spare the people. Now, it's difficult. I have to say that the track record is very mixed. But the goal should be to support the people and to target sanctions. So if, you know, I mean, you know, I got friends who won't come to the United States. I don't know who they're, you know, obviously it's a drop in the ocean when you do that. But you know, you have to. I think you have to be sophisticated about it. Obviously, I mean, you know, there's the boycott, divest movement in Israel, which is obviously, I believe, having a real impact on the way Israel, you know, engages with the rest of the world. So we've got a lot of hands up. The woman in the one, okay, you choose. You choose. I don't want to choose.
Yellow.
Well, that's who I was choosing anyway. So.
I have a question about your kind of victim-centered approach to justice.
Yeah.
In relation to the vast number of cases, especially in Africa, where victims become perpetrators.
Yes.
On the case of Dominic Arquin, who was who's now being indicted by the ICC for international crimes committed as part of a leader in the LRA, but he was also kidnapped by the LRA when he was 10 years old, and arguably became the person he is, the criminal he is, through years of his own victimization. So how do you approach a case like that?
Oof. No, I've dealt with a lot of people like that. I mean, you know, first of all, if you're a child, you should be dealt with as a child. I mean, the first thing is the principle that children do not have the same level, cannot have the same level of criminal responsibility as adults. Second, obviously, that people who act under duress or under coercion don't have the same level of criminal responsibility. I mean, I've kind of seen it go both ways. I mean, in Chad, a lot of people who were in Habré's regime were savagely tortured. So they are both perpetrators and victims, and they have both qualities. You know, I think it depends very much on I guess on the individual case. But obviously, you know, when we're dealing with things like child soldiers, I mean, we start from the principle that these are people who didn't choose to be where they are, and that also the purpose of criminal justice, the purpose of justice in a larger sense, and certainly for children, has to be rehabilitation. Thank you. Sorry we can't continue.
And having prosecutors available. And as you work through that presentation, the two words that you didn't use that I think really signify what it is you do is persistence and preparation. And that impeccable way of pulling together the arguments that are needed to make a persuasive case and having the persistence to stay with it over the numbers of years that we saw as you looked at the various cases and what it took to prosecute them. For that, we all thank you.
Thank you very much.